Welcome to the Bells I Hear podcast. We will speak with experts who will debunk the myths and misconceptions surrounding homelessness and highlight the innovative approaches for addressing the issues, causes, and consequences of housing insecurity. I am Alisa Smith, your host, a mentor, professor of legal studies, and former public defender. Thanks for tuning in to the Bells I Hear. Welcome to the Bells I Hear. Today's conversation begins a series on the intersections of law and homelessness. For today's episode, I am joined by Michael Santos and John Pollock. Michael is the chair of the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and John is a member of the ABA and the coordinator of the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel. Today, we will be talking about legal representation, or lack thereof, and evictions as contributors to housing insecurity. Thank you for joining us today, Michael and John.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Michael is an attorney who has worked on issues of poverty, immigration, civil rights, and homelessness and housing policy. John's work focuses on the right to counsel for litigants facing eviction, loss of child custody, and other serious civil issues. Before we dive in to our topic today, I'd like for both of you to introduce your organizations, your roles, and the goals and purposes. So, Michael, if you could start with your role as chair of the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and what's the purpose of the commission and how it advances the interests of those experiencing homelessness.
Thank you. So thanks for having me here today. So just backtracking a little bit, because the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty is well within the American Bar Association. So the ABA itself is the largest voluntary association of lawyers in the world. And as the national voice of the legal profession, the ABA works to improve the administration of justice. We promote programs that assist lawyers and judges in their work. We help with law school accreditation. We provide continuing legal education to many lawyers across the country. And most importantly, for the purposes of today's conversation, we work to build public understanding around the world of the importance of the rule of law. Now, within the Commission of Homelessness and Poverty, which is a subset, a committee within the ABA, we're charged with several tasks, one of which is educating the members of the bar, the legal community, and the public writ large about legal and other problems that people experiencing homelessness and poverty experience, and ways in which lawyers like myself can assist in solving or addressing them. And then we also train lawyers in areas needed to provide pro bono legal assistance to people experiencing homelessness and poverty. And it goes without saying that we work within other ABA entities and other entities and stakeholders outside of the ABA coalition partners on legal issues that concern people experiencing homelessness. And I would say at the ABA, we have a policy on eviction that centers around the 10 guidelines for residential eviction laws. And this was adopted in 2022. Happy to talk more about it later. But it gives you a flavor of the ABA's position on evictions, which I'm glad that we're having this conversation because it is very timely. And I have more to say, but I want to turn it back to you, Alisa.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And I think people might be surprised that much of what you've talked about isn't really taught in law schools. So once people are lawyers, they need to get extra training about some of these very complicated issues surrounding their clients and their concerns and their complex problems. John, could you tell us a little bit about your role with the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel?
Absolutely. We basically work to support a national movement around the right to counsel and what are called basic human needs cases. What does that term mean? It depends on who you ask. And we don't decide that for anyone. We support cities and states that are figuring that answer out and then saying, we want to advance the right to counsel in this kind of matter. I think it's pretty universally accepted that housing is one of those areas. And in fact, that housing has a cascade effect on almost every other civil area you can think of. And we'll, I'm sure, talk about that later. Our work is in 47 different states. There are people who are trying to get laws passed that create a right to counsel. Some people are in court that are trying to establish it as a constitutional right. And then there's research to show just how dramatic the impact of counsel is. And our role is to basically support all of those different efforts from organizers at the community level, from legal aid, academics, and policymakers themselves.
Yeah, thank you. It's a lot of work. Think we need to start with what is the right to counsel, and do individuals have a right to counsel in civil litigation?
Yeah, it's if you were to walk down the street and ask someone, do you have a right to counsel in civil cases? The answer you would get is probably either yes or no, and neither of those are actually correct, because the right to counsel people know from television, from watching like procedural dramas and seeing people being arrested and it saying you have a right to counsel. If you can't afford one will be given to you. That applies to criminal cases only. That was not intended ever for civil cases. And even some things that people might actually think are criminal, for instance, we're seeing a lot now of immigration matters where people, when you go to immigration court, you're actually potentially in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. There's a prosecutor there. It's not a criminal matter. It's a civil one. And therefore, the right to counsel that was created on the criminal side is not automatically over on the civil side. But all the states have, in fact, passed a right to counsel for some civil areas. And it ranges, what those areas are depends on what state you're looking at. And in housing, there are some that we'll talk about that have done so, cities and states. But what a right to counsel is on the civil side is, at its core, there has to be a law. There has to be something that says you are entitled to counsel. If a city or a state just provides some money for legal aid, that's not a right to counsel. There has to be a law saying such and such people have a right or are entitled to or shall receive counsel. It has to be full representation. This is not a lawyer who just gives someone some advice and then sends them on their way. It has to be an actual lawyer-client relationship. It has to be funded by the government. This is not a charitable endeavor. This is government-funded counsel, just again, like it is on the criminal side. Mm-hmm. Those are very basic pieces. And in the context of housing, the way that it has mostly manifested is around eviction. There are other matters in housing that are critical. When people's housing conditions are not being maintained and their landlord, they want to potentially sue their landlord if they're being discriminated against. Those are all very critically important issues. But the movement so far has mostly coalesced around eviction as the source.
And how many jurisdictions have provided counsel, even in just that limited eviction proceeding?
So prior to 2017, the answer was 0. And that really, when I tell you the number, you have to understand that we're talking about in less than 10 years, 27 jurisdictions have passed a right to counsel, which for a national movement, is extraordinarily rapid growth. That's 20 cities, 5 states, and 2 counties. What those laws look like, we could talk about. They're not all exactly the same. They don't necessarily cover all tenants. They may define who's eligible. But those are all laws that were passed at the city and state level, funded by the government, and are now being implemented by legal services attorneys around the country.
Are they passing these entitlements in certain areas of the country more than others, or is it happening in different places throughout the United States?
That's another thing that would really surprise people, is the first few places maybe that passed, New York, San Francisco, might not have been surprising to people. That's what they think. Yeah. But we don't think that they would necessarily expect Louisville or New Orleans or Bozeman, Montana. These are places that have passed right to counsel alongside some of the more maybe expected places. And in my time working on right to counsel, we've worked with 170 jurisdictions in the last decade at the city and county and state level. And they are in, again, almost every state at this point has had an initiative that has been pursued to establish a right to counsel.
Right. So there's a lot of momentum. Michael, when you were a lawyer in Bay Area Legal Services in San Francisco, you were there at a time when they established a city-funded law for legal representation. So it's kind of like you got to experience a natural experiment in science, we would call that, right? You were the before and the after. Did it make a difference?
Absolutely. So, by way of background, I used to be an eviction defense attorney at Bay Area Legal Aid in San Francisco. So I practiced in California. This was several years ago. And as John had alluded to, San Francisco was the second city to have a right to counsel. Right. And this came on the heels after voters passed Proposition F in June of 2018. So again, after 2017, not too long ago, that established a city funded full scope legal representation for at-risk renters. And so it made it a universal right. And one of the key differences between New York and San Francisco at the time, at least my experience, was that in San Francisco, we didn't have income limitations. So anyone who was getting evicted and had to go make an appearance in housing court is entitled to an attorney. And that's what I meant by full scope. Full scope meaning from notice, from the moment a person or a household gets a notice of eviction to taking that possibly to trial or settling that case so that they can stay longer or prevent the eviction from happening. We took on all those cases, right? And the right to counsel when I was in San Francisco practicing made a big difference. And you have to remember that this was at the time, unbeknownst to me and my colleagues, it was at the time, it took place right before the pandemic hit. And so I was able to practice at the peak of the pandemic, right? And didn't really expect it at the time that there was going to be a global pandemic that will put a stop in everything that we do normally as a society. But at the time, most of the non-payment cases stopped. Right. And by non-payment cases, these are your run-of-the-mill cases, eviction cases where a tenant or a household is being evicted because they weren't able to pay rent. And for the most part, that's like a bulk of eviction cases, right? But I'm sure John can touch on this later. In the case in San Francisco, a lot of the nuisance or health and safety violation cases were moving forward at the peak of the pandemic. And so these are cases where you could see a tenant being evicted because they were allegedly hoarding or there was a nuisance that was causing problems within the property. So these are the types of cases that I was seeing. And right to counsel prevented homelessness, right? Because at the time, the main concern during the pandemic is that we cannot let people lose their housing because that is like one of the safeguards and protections that they have from contracting COVID, from getting exposed to the elements, from getting potentially exposed to COVID. And so, very little was known at the very beginning of the pandemic. And so having the right to counsel at that time really made a big difference from not just preventing homelessness, but preventing people from actually getting COVID and from being exposed on the streets. I would say that the right to counsel when I was practicing in San Francisco also helped slow down the evictions, not just because as a function of the pandemic itself, which put a pause on a lot of court proceedings, but because lawyers like myself played a very, very important, critical role in preserving tenancy for households, right? Sometimes it's a challenge to prevent someone from getting evicted, but as lawyers, we're able to negotiate an agreement with the landlord or with the building where they're living in such a way that they can stay longer, that they don't have to be evicted, that they, as long as they comply with certain terms of the agreement. One thing I would say, as someone who's done this work on the trenches, is that evictions are rapid, they're complicated, and deeply consequential, right? One of the things that I was exposed to, and this was, I did not know that I was walking into this when I took the job as an eviction defense attorney, is that evictions move at a very fast clip, Most people think that they can get a lot of time when they're in court, when they're in front of a judge. But the reality is that there are so many eviction cases being filed and adjudicated, right, processed through the court systems in front of a judge that you you'd be lucky if you get like 5 minutes of the time with with the judge or in court. And all of this to say that these are high stakes issues, right? When you go in there, you need to know what the law is, and that's why it's really really important to have legal representation as much as possible throughout the eviction proceedings, because a lawyer can help you navigate what the eviction process could look like.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of moving pieces to that. And I'm not going to get into it, the details, the technical differences. But I would also say, in my practice, I think I was able to serve a lot of people, a lot of clients with disability, right? Many people experiencing homelessness even before they get evicted or before they went through the eviction process. And the reality is, if they get evicted, they're more likely to experience homelessness again if they're unable to preserve that housing. And so that's really where this right to counsel and how it made a difference in the lives of tenants living in San Francisco at the time.
So there's short-term and long-term benefits to counsel, right? The immediacy of not being evicted, but then the long-term consequence of not having the eviction on your record. Is John, do you get a sense that eviction rates are increasing or decreasing since, say, COVID?
I will. I just want to add something to what Michael said before I get to that, which is that in some places, people would be lucky if their hearings lasted 5 minutes, because the average is actually way lower than that. It's more like 60 seconds. And a major study that was done in the last year found that you'll sometimes hear landlords say, this is just delaying the inevitable. That's all that lawyers are doing. They're just dragging it out. This study actually found that the additional time that the tenants got actually changed whether they got evicted or not. It was not simply a pointless delay. It actually changed the outcome of the case itself. And that we've known that for a long time, but this study really helped reinforce that. So I just wanted to flag those things.
Yeah.
The eviction numbers have gone up since COVID. In fact, the eviction lab, which I encourage people to look at, has found that many places have exceeded even what it was before the pandemic. And that's not something I think we really expected. There are some economic forces at play. The economy, inflation, in some places hyperinflation, is really pushing people out of their units, and immigration enforcement is also causing disruptions to households that lead to potentially the wage earner not being available and the family being evicted, and many other factors.
Yeah. You've both touched on this, but who are the individuals that are getting evicted or being subjected to these proceedings where they are experiencing housing insecurity and sometimes homelessness because of the eviction proceeding?
Well, the data shows that it's consistently and disproportionately people of color, in some places significantly disproportionately when you look at their representation in the population. It just doesn't add up. Even if you're trying to say it's a question of poverty, it's still disproportionate. And that's very, very disturbing, which is why we view right to counsel as a race equity issue. But realistically, our data shows that without a right to counsel, only about 4% of tenants get 4% get access to counsel. That's compared to 83% of the landlords. So really, almost anyone who's facing eviction is very unlikely to have assistance unless there's a right to counsel, meaning that a lot of people are in the same boat. But there's no question that when you look at the numbers, people of color are disproportionately being forced through eviction court, without question.
And why is that?
Well, we could write a dissertation about that. There are a lot
not.
of let's not. But there are a lot of forces that you can look at that cause people to face eviction, and housing segregation and housing quality, the housing that's accessible to people, income inequality is another. The lack of affordable housing overall is another factor. There are many factors that push people into an eviction situation.
if I could just add to
Yes.
what John was saying, in response to your question, Alyssa, who's affected, right? And I think what John said tracks with what I've seen in practice, right? It's mostly low-income households, those experiencing homelessness, those who have experienced homelessness, those who are experiencing poverty, but it's also broader than that. We're looking at people who have experienced domestic violence or sexual assault, people who identify as LGBTQ, people who with disabilities. These are the demographics of the people who I've worked with when I was when I was part of the cohort of attorneys implementing the right to counsel in San Francisco. That said, you've asked, like, well, who do you see in these eviction proceedings, right? Eviction proceedings taking place in court is a piece of a broader puzzle, where you also have to think about what leads up to the case being filed in the first place. And you also have to consider what happens to the tenant or the household once they get a judgment from the court. And to John's point, you're seeing you're seeing a lot of issues that disproportionately impact people of color in particular, in these communities, right? Poverty, domestic violence. There's a lot of disproportionalities that overlap between these issues and racial equity. And so that's what I've seen. That's what we're seeing still, continuing to see. And as John said, we could write a dissertation or talk about this for ad nauseum, but we don't have enough time.
I just want to add too that evictions are cyclical. Once you're evicted and you have an eviction on your record, and it's often called the Scarlet E, because once you have one, the chance of you finding adequate housing in the future goes down tremendously, which means that you're going to wind up in a situation that's much more precarious and then subject to another eviction in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's
And-
compounding.
It's almost like a catch-22, right? And I think that's where lawyers, like, as part of the right to counsel, eviction defense attorneys play an important role, because part of it is not just preserving the tenancy or preventing someone from experiencing homelessness, but also preventing the collateral consequences, as to John's point, right? We don't want, because to John's point, once you have an eviction on your record, it is much harder to secure housing. And if you get evicted from a federally subsidized housing, for example, good luck, right? Because it is even harder. You face a 10-year ban.
Oh, wow.
If you live in like public housing and you get evicted.
So 10 years is a long time. And the Scarlet E, all of these compounding collateral consequences, I guess I have two questions. One is, what do these people do to get housing, which is kind of a foundational, fundamental need? And then, Michael, I'd love for you to be able to share a story where, you're someone who you represented had a really good outcome from that representation. I think those two questions, and you can each take one. I guess, Michael, you can answer you have a story where counsel really helped, and maybe John, you can, if there's any sense in the data about what happens to these individuals. I mean, what do they do?
You mean once they're evicted?
Yeah, and they have a 10-year federal ban.
Well, I think the one thing that happens is they become unhoused. And we know that because the data shows that there's a direct correlation between eviction and homelessness. And it can be as many as a quarter of the people evicted that go directly into homelessness. And part of the problem is the data is definitely underselling it, because it typically looks at who goes from eviction to homelessness. But sometimes people will double up with a friend or a family member, and then they go to homelessness. And it doesn't show, the data will not show that the eviction was the direct cause necessarily. So we know that people cycle in and out of homelessness as a result of that. Where they don't have that, they again may find a temporary situation with someone where they can just but those situations are very precarious. They're often not on the lease of somewhere else, and they're trying to just get by being there, or there's like tremendous crowding, or And I think it's worth just taking a moment to say, while they're dealing with all of that, there are all of these other things that are going to happen or could happen as a result. One really big one, if they don't have a stable home, their children may be at risk. They may be at risk of losing those children because they don't have that. Their children may lose access to their school because they can't stay where their children were. Their health, even people who don't wind up homelessness, the studies show their health is significantly worse as a result of being evicted. And really, the list just goes on and on and on. When we get asked, what does losing your housing affect? Where it's more the question is, what doesn't it affect? It affects almost everything.
Every aspect of your life. Yeah. I mean, Michael, can you share a story of success where having a lawyer helped and someone didn't become unhoused?
Yeah, I have a lot of good stories, and I don't know how much time we have. I would just like to go back to my earlier comment about how evictions are disruptive, right? Because I think that really made me appreciate, after having represented a lot of tenants, a lot of clients in front in front of a judge in San Francisco housing. And one of the positive outcomes I was able to get was preserving a tenancy for my client who was living in federally subsidized housing. So this was a low-income housing tax credit. And at the time, I didn't realize that one of the clients actually stopped going to school. Right? John had talked about the impact of evictions on children. And I've seen that firsthand, what happens when eviction comes knocking at your door. You get an eviction notice and your family has to deal with that and have to go to court, right? Because you have to think about when I think people take for granted that, yeah, you just go to court, right? Like it's more than just that, right? If you have kids, for example, that really disrupts your day, especially if you have if you have to go to work, right? You have to figure out childcare in order to make that 60-second appearance. And so having an attorney really helps navigate that process. And at the end of the day, we were able to preserve that housing. They were able to stay in their home. And the other thing I would flag, at least, and it's not just like one story, but it's multiple stories. Something worth bringing up is that it's never just about evictions. It's never just about housing instability. So one of the things I had appreciated after having worked at Bay Area Legal Aid and serving as an eviction defense attorney within a legal aid organization is that we work and we partner with social workers. And I cannot tell you enough, I cannot even emphasize enough how important and critical the work of social workers do on a day-to-day to help our clients, because they come to the lawyers, to the attorneys with their eviction cases, but oftentimes when they're getting evicted because they're unable to pay rent, it's a symptom of a broader, more systemic problem, right? I've had clients before where I'm unable to pay the rent because I had to choose between paying rent and paying for food for my family. And so if I had to pick, I'd pick the food, right? And they were getting evicted because they were unable to pay, to come up with the money to pay for that month's rent. And so it's small things like that really, that brought me joy when I was doing this work and serving as an eviction defense attorney for many clients in San Francisco.
Yeah. I mean, you're representing the people facing the evictions, you're representing the children. I mean, these have very wide-ranging, domino effect, positive domino effect on these families. And I think you've both touched on some of the myths and misconceptions surrounding housing, insecurity, and eviction. And one of the things we try to do with the podcast is to identify those myths and debunk them. So I'd like for both of you to identify one. I know there's many. But if you can identify one misconception that you think is most prevalent and how both of your organizations are trying to work to provide better information to people so they have more accurate understanding of evictions and housing insecurity in this country.
I'm happy to start. I think the one that is the most prevalent and the most and one of the wrongest is that eviction cases are simple. This is a narrative that has been promulgated for a long time. by the real estate community because it serves their purposes of saying it's fine that these evictions last for 60 seconds because there's really nothing to figure out. If the tenant didn't pay the rent, what is there to discuss?
Right.
First of all, not all of the cases are non-payment of rent. The ones that aren't about non-payment are very complicated because they're about whether the tenant breached the lease in some kind of way, and it often can get complicated. Second of all, just because it's about non-payment, alleged non-payment, that doesn't mean the tenant actually didn't pay or that the amount that the landlord is charging is legal. There are laws that control what a landlord is allowed to charge, and landlords violate those laws, and that has to be looked at. Or that the tenant may have paid and the landlord didn't credit it properly, or they're withholding, the landlord there are just all these ways in which the amount in question can be disputed. Yeah. Another big factor, if the landlord has not maintained the unit in many jurisdictions, that changes the amount of rent that the tenant is going to have to pay. And that is a complicated issue that has to be looked at. The landlord has laws that they have to follow about how they carry out the eviction, and they routinely don't follow those laws. They don't serve notice correctly. They don't, there are various stages of that notice that they're supposed to follow. They don't file the right documents in court. And without a lawyer, there's no chance that a tenant is going to know any of those things.
What's interesting about what you just said, John, is that earlier you said that 84% of the landlords actually have lawyers. And so now you're saying they're filing documents improperly. So is it the lawyers that are filing these documents? And because that was one of my follow-up questions, was about how is the legal system contributing to this phenomenon of evictions and homelessness? Rather than fixing it, they're contributing to it.
Yeah, it happens with the lawyers too. You'll talk to legal aid attorneys who will just say, like, some of these lawyers just cannot seem to get it right. Like, even when they have gone to court many times, they still do things wrong. And honestly, with no checks and balances system, why should they care? Like, they've been able to do whatever they wanted. Judges do not, for the most part, gatekeep at all in eviction court. It doesn't matter how wrong the filing is or what documents are missing. They will not say to the landlord, hey, hang on a second, you're supposed to file lead paint certificate compliance and it's not here. I'm dismissing this eviction. Or they just let it go. If the tenant doesn't raise it, they let it go. So it's really shocking when you start to see just how much that happens.
Yeah.
And I think to John's point, it's, where the right to counsel attorneys play an important role is acting as a check and balance to the system itself, right? Because yes, as I mentioned before, eviction proceedings move at a very fast clip, and so if you don't stop and pay attention, right, you can't really see the mistakes. Let alone if you don't have an attorney defending your case, it is really, really difficult to figure out. Are you doing this correctly? Is the landlord's attorney doing this correctly? Right? Because it goes both sides, right? Like the tenants as well need some help because it is an uphill battle. It is very challenging to go pro se or appear in front of a housing judge without an attorney, right?
And there's also in some of these jurisdictions, there is local, state, and federal law that are all potentially applicable to the same eviction. And even for attorneys, sometimes it can be complicated to try to make sure you've thought about everything that you have to look at. And the chance that the tenant, again, is going to know any of those, let alone all of them, is very, very low. And the reason that we know, one more thing I'll say too, is that even if none of that is present, none of those issues is present. And there are more. There's housing discrimination, other things that can come in. Even if none of that is present, they will generally still have to decide in the court, how long does this tenant get to vacate? What kind of rent judgment are they going to issue? And is this eviction going to go on the tenant's record? And those are all very important questions that can be the difference between becoming homeless and not becoming homeless. Winding up with your belongings on the street or being able to take them with you. Those are, without a lawyer, the chance of the tenant getting relief on those points is almost zero. We know that from the data. That's not just speculation. When tenants don't have lawyers, they are summarily evicted, their belongings wind up on the street, and that is what happens. Yeah. When they have counsel, That 90% of the time, that does not happen.
Because things slow down and then there's more due process. Because
It's slowing down, and also because the tenant's attorney can say to the landlord's attorney, look, your client has not done the following things, and we could go to court and argue about that, or let's work out an agreement that's fair to both sides. What happens without the tenant lawyer is the tenant goes to court, the judge sends them in the hallway, says, I want you to go talk to the landlord's attorney. And the landlord's attorney says, here's what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen, and you're going to agree to it. That's not a negotiation. It's coerced. And even though it's called a settlement, it's absolutely not that.
No, it's unilateral. It's
Right.
a unilateral negotiation, which is not really a negotiation.
I would say I've also had experience, and this has come up a couple of times in my practice, where the landlord attorney had reached out and said, "I'm really glad you're here," right? Because there are challenges sometimes dealing with someone who is not represented, right? But I think to John's point, and this gives you a flavor of what it's like to go through an eviction process from a client's perspective, from a tenant household perspective. It is very stressful. Right. And it's even more stressful because they don't know what's ahead. Right. They just know, like, oh my God, I have to appear in court. I got this notice. Some people's tendency is to just ignore that. Right. By the time they come to me, I was like, well, like the notice has lapsed and you're going to get evicted, but we can undo some of that legal work and give you some assistance.
It is also a mistake to think of all landlords as all the same. They're not. In fact, the data also shows that corporate landlords are much more quick to evict and much more quick to serially evict tenants than smaller landlords are. Right. Smaller landlords tend to have a closer relationship with their tenants, which actually makes it harder for them to go through, the landlords to go through an eviction, which is why many of them will say they prefer that the tenant has a lawyer, because then they can deal with the tenant's lawyer and not the tenant themselves, where that relationship has really broken down. It can be very stressful for the landlord too, to have to deal with eviction in a small landlord situation.
Right.
From a tenant's perspective, it is very stressful and very disruptive, right? And I think for a good chunk of the eviction proceedings, their main goal is just to look at the short-term reactionary work, right? When they're reacting to the eviction proceedings, they're not, it's very rare to see a client and hear them talk about, well, what is going to happen when I actually do get the eviction on my record, right? Or what's going to, how can I prevent this from happening? How can I negotiate with my landlord? And so attorneys, tenant attorneys play a very, very important role in really helping not just educate, but like defend their cases and present a more long-term picture, right? Like, this is what you need to know, because lawyers play an important role in negotiating these settlement agreements where the tenant gets to stay, or the tenant gets to prolong their stay in the unit, right? And so I wanted to flag that because that's an issue that I've seen in terms of, like, eviction cases are simple, but it's not, right? It's not. That's definitely a myth.
No, it's highly complex. Legal language is difficult to understand and comprehend, short and long-term consequences. Michael, is there another myth or misconception that you think is prevalent that we can debunk today?
I have a bunch. I think we've already touched on this a little bit, but eviction doesn't lead to homelessness. And I think John had made a good point earlier that there's data showing the correlation between the two, right? And I think I speak from my own experience about this and how evictions, there are different actors and there's different stages to the eviction, right? You're talking about the landlord giving the tenant notice, and then you're talking about the tenant having to go to court, and then the judges adjudicating or processing their eviction cases. And then you talk about the sheriff, actually, if there is an order, a judgment from the housing court judge, evicting someone, it's really the sheriff's department for the most part on the local level that implements the order. So, the buck stops with them. But I think these stakeholders, the courts, the landlords, the tenants, the sheriff, the police department, they all need to understand the role that they play in someone, having someone come from being stably housed to losing their home and potentially experiencing homelessness.
So if someone is living in one of those jurisdictions that doesn't have legal representation available to them, and they cannot afford to hire an attorney, as most often they can't, obviously, where do they get help? How do they find help? How do they become informed? If they must act pro se, how do they best prepare for that experience?
Well, the first thing that they should do is contact their local legal aid organization, because even where there's not a right to counsel, the legal aid programs do some amount of eviction defense. Usually it's one of the areas they typically do. Not all of them. Some don't. They handle only custody or whatever. But eviction is a common area, so they should contact that group. There are also other groups that sometimes do. There are volunteer lawyer associations that do. Either they'll represent people, or like I live in Montgomery, Alabama. We have a drop-in clinic that I volunteer at, and people can come. It's run a couple times a month, and you can come in and get advice on your eviction matter about what to do. If you don't have anything like that, it's going to be a challenge. And I don't want to suggest, there are other resources out there. There are self-help websites that try to help you figure out, this is how an eviction works. And, these are things you need to do in your state to sort of even respond to avoid a default. In some states, if you don't file an answer, if you think, I can just go to court, and you don't file an answer, you'll default. You won't even get a hearing. And people don't realize that. They don't know that. So some of these websites will try to at least warn people about some of the things they have to do to keep their case going. But ultimately, when it gets to the merits of their case, expecting them to try to do that with these resources, it's going to be very challenging.
Right.
I would add that, and maybe John can correct me on this, but at least in some places where there's a right to counsel, chances are, if you are getting evicted and you have to go to housing court, the court itself, when you're doing the filings and when you're responding to the eviction notice, they might have a list of resources, right? And some courts do that already. And so that's like another resource. But is that the common practice? Is that prevalent? No. Right. It depends on the jurisdiction. It depends on the court. Some courts don't even have the resources or the bandwidth to provide the resources to the tenants who may need legal help. I would say that within the American Bar Association, we do have some resources there. And so for the most part, we do our best to connect people who need legal assistance. But at the end of the day, we still don't have enough lawyers to do this work. Right?
I will also add, this is just a really fascinating anecdote to me, that, when you go to court, you'll see landlords' attorneys say things like, Judge, can you schedule my cases for now because I got to be somewhere else? And the judges will do that because they have a relationship with these attorneys. If a tenant were to say, I have to get to work, and I need to hear, that would get them nowhere. It's like such an extreme difference in the way that they're treated by the court. And also, not only do, in some ways judges go out of their way to help the landlords in that fashion, but I spoke to one judge who told me that she was telling tenants, you really should go find a lawyer. That's all she said. And she was pulled aside by a senior judge saying, you're not allowed to say that. Like,
because it was legal advice? It was giving
no, because it was taking sides.
Oh.
Like that you were like helping the tenant, and that was unfair to the landlord, which was mind-blowing. Just mind-blowing. The idea that suggesting that you might need a lawyer was somehow tipping the scale, especially in light of what the courts already do so much of for landlords.
Right. The inequities already built into the system. So what are the future goals of both of your organizations, Michael with the commission and John with the coalition, to begin to address these issues? Like, what's the current goal or plan that your organizations have?
I'll start us off, at least for the ABA. We want to implement those eviction guidelines, right? Because it's the right to counsel I know I didn't talk about this earlier, but the right to counsel is a small, like it's a piece of a broader puzzle when it comes to the guidelines. Like there are other issues that we already touched on today's podcast, right? We talked about the due process, right? Making sure that tenants get the due process that they're owed in eviction proceedings. The right to counsel, getting good quality legal representation. But there's also other issues that we want to see and implement on the local level, making sure that tenants get, that they get evicted for good, or they get evicted for good cause, right? Like, because some evictions are illegal, right? Like the landlord will just go ahead and lock you out, and that's not supposed to happen. We also want them to be able to get a lot of notice, because sometimes what it boils down to is getting that notice, right? Like if you let that notice lapse, that's really when eviction proceedings ramp up and speed up in terms of, getting it resolved quickly, and possibly losing your housing. There's also issues around right to cure, meaning the tenant should be able to work it out with the landlord, and be given a chance to fix the violations. Because I think John had talked about this earlier. Sometimes it boils down to that relationship between the landlord or the property manager and the tenant, right? And when we've seen some jurisdictions put in place some eviction diversion programs, where they have the landlord or the landlord's attorney and the tenant or the tenant's attorney work it out and see if they can come to an agreement of what makes the most sense in terms of preserving that tenant or that household's tenancy, and keeping them housed.
So-
That's for me, John. I don't know if you have anything.
I do want to just ask one quick follow-up, Michael. When you say that these are guidelines from the ABA, who are they guidelines for? They're not required, they're not laws. Who are they guidance for, and are they really just persuasive?
Yeah, it's persuasive authority because it's not like we're creating federal law here, right? And it's really encouraging state, local jurisdictions for the most part, and the attorneys working for tenants, and the stakeholders that work with tenants who are getting evicted, state and local governments, for example. These are the ones that are meant to be encouraged by the policy resolution that the ABA had passed in 2022. But again, part of that is this right to counsel. We support and we continue to support efforts to provide counsel or an attorney to tenants who are in eviction proceedings.
Yeah, thank you. And John, what's the coalition working on?
Well, I could say that our end goal is a right to counsel for every tenant in the country, but really the end goal is about housing stability. That the counsel is just a means to an end. And even if we got a right to counsel for every tenant, the question would be, is it being done in a way that's working? It doesn't automatically, just because you get a lawyer, the program has to be run correctly. We spend a lot of time on looking at how these are implemented, because that's just as important as the law itself. So what we really want to see is not only does a right to counsel exist, but the programs are delivering in a way such that what happens is what's supposed to happen. Like that's essentially what it is. And to the maximum extent possible, that no one's life is disruptively displaced, because it's bad for everyone. And that's one last point I will make, is that one of the studies that there have been now more than a dozen studies that have shown that basically providing a lawyer is so much cheaper than dealing with the consequences of not providing a lawyer. It hurts all of us when people wind up homeless, because everyone is paying for it, not just that family, but the whole community is paying for it. And when that's avoidable, why wouldn't we do it? It doesn't make any sense. It's absolutely the right thing to do morally, and it's the right thing to do legally, and it's the right thing to do financially.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add, and I think John nailed this on the head. It's not a win-win situation, right? Like no one wins when someone gets evicted or goes through the eviction process, because from the landlord side, it costs money, right? Especially if you're dealing with a mom and pop landlord or a small, like a small landlord, not like a corporate landlord. It costs a lot of money to go to court, right? But on the tenant side, not only, like I talked about this earlier, it's not just disruptive, it's stressful, and the actual detrimental impacts of eviction cannot be understated, right? It has health impacts, societal impacts, and it makes it even harder for someone to secure future housing if and when they get an eviction on their record.
Yeah. And if someone were interested in learning more or volunteering or getting involved, they hear this podcast and they think, this is a societal issue and I want to get involved. Where do they go? What do they do?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the biggest problems we have right now is we don't have enough of these lawyers. Like, even when we win a right to counsel and there's funding, there aren't enough attorneys who are signing up to be what I would consider to be part of a national movement and really affecting societal change by being one of these lawyers. So if you're a lawyer and listening to this, I would highly encourage you to think about a career in this. We haven't talked about this, but one of the things that this study found was that right to counsel doesn't just change what happens to each individual tenant. The whole system changes as a result of there being systemic representation, because these lawyers are seeing the big picture when they're there all the time. And it enables them to say, wow, we really need to change this law. This court is not functioning correctly. The landlords themselves, their behavior changes when they file, or how frequently or how quickly changes as a result. It changes everything. And you can be part of that if you're a lawyer. If you're not a lawyer, go to law school. We need more, public interest minded people to come out and do this work. And if you're, and support the movement, there are efforts, as I said, going on in over 100 jurisdictions. There probably is one in your city or state. And reach out to us. We can connect you to the people that are working on it, and see how you can plug in.
Great. Michael, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I'm sad. I should have made this caveat earlier, but not to speak on behalf of the ABA. What I'm sharing today is mostly my own personal thoughts. But there is a way we can connect with the ABA, right? I encourage you to look us up, look up the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. One of our projects right now is to increase those connections between tenants, people experiencing homelessness, and attorneys, right? But to John's point, there's just not enough. And so I highly encourage folks who are listening or watching this podcast to check out the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. But if you're not a lawyer, even if you're a lawyer, you should also be talking to your lawmakers, policymakers, and elected officials, right? I think we need to keep the drumbeat, so to speak, because we can't lose momentum. Everyone complains about the high cost of housing, and yet, why are we stuck, right? And I think it's really, really important to keep elevating this issue to your lawmakers, whether that be on the local, on the state, or even on the federal level. It's really, really important to highlight not just the cost of housing, but housing instability and evictions, and the importance of having legal representation in these eviction proceedings.
Right. It sounds like an area that would be perfect for law schools to create clinics.
Yes, in fact, there was just a study that was released by New York Law School. You can find it on the internet, that looked at how our law school is helping with this, what we call the pipeline problem.
Right.
And it found that actually in the last 7 years, there have been a ton of housing clinics that have started, and they are feeding law students directly into the pipeline. The clinics themselves do eviction work. Right. That's fantastic. And they're training people to feel like, wow, this is a career I might want to pursue. And then they go out and become legal aid attorneys. So it's just tremendous.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for this conversation, filled with all kinds of important information. And hopefully in a couple of years, we'll come back and we'll talk about the new trends of legal representation in eviction proceedings.
I would just add one thing before we close out. I think it's really important, just not just to work with lawmakers, policymakers, elected officials, go to law school if you want, but also I think just being open to advocating and pushing for new solutions, right? Because I think as we speak about this eviction problem, housing instability problem, the need for more lawyers, these are not static problems. They continue to evolve, right? As the need continues to grow, as the need continues to evolve as well. And so we need creative solutions because housing problems, housing instability, homelessness, evictions, and poverty, they also continue to evolve. And I think this is, I mean, this is a shameless plug, but I'm glad that we're doing this series on other issues that touch on evictions, right? Including the role of technology and AI, for example, or the growing trend of criminalization of homelessness and poverty. These are the things that intersect with evictions in many different ways. And so I'm looking forward to that conversation in the future with other speakers on this podcast.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great plug. And for people who are interested, we will be touching on those topics with other folks. This is a very complicated issue, but there's also lots of good solutions. So thank you. Go ahead.
One last thing. Sorry, Alisa. I think this is something that it's probably obvious to many folks listening or paying attention, but you need to support organizations like NCCRC, the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, organizations that do a lot of good work in facilitating these, connecting tenants with landlords, with attorneys, and really improving access to justice for many tenants who are on the brink of getting evicted.
Yeah. All good ideas. Well, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Bells I Hear podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the Bells I Hear and follow us on social media. We post all of our conversations on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. You can connect with us on Instagram and post comments or questions that we can address on upcoming shows. More information can also be found on Blogger and Substack. So many ways to learn about the issues surrounding housing insecurity. Please join us and contribute to the conversation.